I pray that you are well. Today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter number 3, and I encourage you to open your Bibles for this Bible study. Open up your Bibles now, please, to Daniel chapter number 3, if you would, please. Now, the last time we were together in this study, we were in Daniel chapter 2, and we had looked at this well-known story. I'd like to begin with a brief review of where we were in Daniel chapter 2. Of course, in chapter 1 is the famous, well-known story of Daniel and his friends finding an alternative to the food that was not fit to eat. Then we have Daniel chapter number 2, the famous statue dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this great statue. And we learned that this dream tells the story in Daniel 2 of the Holy Land during the epoch of Israel's dispersion. It's a window of history, a long window of history, telling the story of the Holy Land during the epoch of Israel's dispersion. We discover that each kingdom is culturally inferior to its predecessor. And there are 4 kingdoms that are described there. The first kingdom was gold, which represented Babylon. The second is silver, in Daniel 2, Persia. The third portion, the belly and the legs, was Greece. And then moving on down to the lower legs and the feet, we have the iron clay portion, which represents Islam. And finally, we discovered at the end of Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar was quite impressed with Daniel. He had set a trap for his wise men, and he asked them to not only interpret the dream, but tell him the dream. And they could not tell him the dream, but Daniel did. And of course, that was complete amazement to Nebuchadnezzar. And because of this, we discover at the end of the chapter that Nebuchadnezzar advanced Daniel to a very lofty position. And at Daniel's request, he even elevated and gave very fine positions of leadership to his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So that concludes Daniel 2. Now, when we begin Daniel chapter number 3, there's a very important thought we have to begin with. Everything you read in Scripture, like so many situations of life, has to always be within the context, the very best of our ability. The context of the times, the context of the history, what is the background information. And Daniel chapter 3 is no exception. Now, we're familiar with many of the stories of Daniel, the book of Daniel. We'll come eventually to Daniel in the lion's den and things that are, it's not a book that is obscure by any means. But there is a tendency to take each of the stories that are found in the book of Daniel and take them out as standalone stories. And forget about the before and the after and all the background information that could be useful to give a broader understanding. And that's the case in Daniel chapter number 3. I mean, how many have not heard of the Daniel story here, the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace? How many have never heard that story? Well, if you've been a churchgoer most of your life, you've heard it over and over again. Or at least you have some familiarity, right? Yes. We all know more or less kind of the general storyline. But typically, we just hear it as a story that stands alone, by itself, without the context of the circumstances surrounding it. And I'm hoping today to try to fill in some of the background context, how chapter 3 fits in with Daniel chapter 2, we've already looked at. So that we understand what's going on here, and maybe we can get just a little bit more out of the story. It's certainly a marvelous story, and the looking at the 3 men, as we will, is really a wonderful thing. So but let's try to do this. Let's try to look at it in the context of the entire book of Daniel and the historic context of the times. What we know about the Babylonian Empire, the people that lived there, how they lived, why they did the things they did, how they would think and react, and things of this nature. So let's begin by reading the first 12 verses. What I'm going to do is I ask you to open your Bible and simply follow along. I'm going to begin reading now in Daniel chapter number 3. I'm going to read the first 12 verses. You just follow along, please. Please follow along. You don't have to say anything. Just sit quietly and follow along. Reading out of the King James Bible now. Daniel chapter 3. Here we go. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plains of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together into the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace." Therefore at that time, when the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." All right. Now, let's pause. Let's make sure we understand the story. The image that the king set up was of all gold. We don't know what the image was. There are some scholars who think that this was a god, Marduk, or some other Babylonian god. There are others who think that this was an image of the king himself. It was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. But the Bible does not say, and I cannot nail that point down. You'll notice it was set up in Babylon, in the plain of Dura, right near the city. This was a central location of the empire. It was near the capital city of the entire empire. They will also notice that the people who gathered together received the commandment to come and to bow down. You'll notice it was bowing down. And bowing down equals worship. Worship equals bowing down. The people that came were all the political leaders, and it gives a list. Now, this was not a command. Not everyone in the empire assembled at the plain of Dura. Would have been impossible anyway. But it was a dedication ceremony, and much like we might dedicate a monument, this was a monument being set up, and all of the political leaders in the empire came to the dedication ceremony and were commanded to be present. They spoke different languages, many of them, but they were all the political leaders, the counselors, the sheriffs, the satraps, and all this, etc., etc. That is who was present. The princes, the judges. So then the command goes out, the music plays, everyone's supposed to fall down. We could go into the music, but we won't. Then we discover that some people came forward and said, "Hey, wait a minute, there's 3 people over here, these Jews, these Judeans, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused." Now, how did they discover that the 3 had refused? Well, it was given to them by Chaldeans. It says that Chaldeans came to the king and said they refused. Now, who are the Chaldeans? The word Chaldean is a person from Chaldea, which is the central province of Babylon. So you could, in a sense, view the word Babylonian and Chaldean as rough synonyms to each other. So these were people who were Babylonian. These were not. And that's actually a significant point. That it was the Chaldeans who were upset that the Judeans did not bow down. Question, why were they upset? Why did they point them out? And then, of course, they remind the king of what he said. Oh, by the way, in verse 9, when they approached the king, the first thing they said to the king was, "O king," what did they say? "O king, live forever." Why did they say that? I mean, everybody knows that everyone dies, right? Why would they say, "O king, live forever"? Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't going to live forever. Nebuchadnezzar knew that. Everyone knows that. No one lives forever. Why would they say, "O king, live forever"? Is there a reason that they began with that statement? Well, there is a little background story, and that's significant. Well, we discover then as we move down that these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had been identified, and they had been fingered as disobeying the command. All right, so let's go to the outline now. Point number 1. First question that could be asked. Why did Nebuchadnezzar make a statue made only of gold? Is there a reason why it was made of gold? All gold? Why wasn't it made all silver? Or why wasn't it made partly of gold or silver? Why was it gold and only gold? Okay, let's go back to Daniel chapter number 2. And if you recall the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it was a statue that had 4 portions, and the first portion was the golden head. And when the interpretation came of that dream by Daniel, and Daniel, of course, this was made in the court of the king, in the presence of many people, so it was, in a sense, a public interpretation. Everyone in the court would have heard the interpretation in Daniel chapter 2. So when Daniel said, "O king, you represent that golden head," and then he goes on to say, "After you will come the silver kingdom." No timeline was given. Daniel said, "After you will come the silver kingdom." And then there'll come other kingdoms. And that will pose for Nebuchadnezzar, even though he was initially very impressed with this brilliant man, it posed a grave political problem for Nebuchadnezzar. Because Daniel was predicting the fall and the collapse of Nebuchadnezzar, the golden head. He was predicting that. Now, when you go to a king, an absolute monarch, and you predict the demise of that monarch, there's a political problem that arises. This tells us why the Chaldeans, they did come to King Nebuchadnezzar later in chapter 3, why they began their entire their discussion and their accusation. They said, "O king, live forever." See, what was going on is Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 was forced to respond to this political challenge that he had received in chapter 2. Point A in our outline, Nebuchadnezzar rejected the interpretation that his kingdom, the gold head, would fall. He rejected that interpretation. In a sense, for his own security, he was forced to reject that interpretation. Public opinion amongst all of the people in his kingdom forced him to take action to show that his kingdom was secure. And more than secure, it forced him to take action to show that he was able to flush out enemies who wished to see it collapse. And you say, "Well, I didn't know Nebuchadnezzar had enemies." All kings have enemies. And the idea that a king, to give you another illustration of this whole idea of how kings had to manage their kingdoms, even if we jump forward to the days, let's go to Tudor England. Did you know that in Tudor England, when King Henry VIII was dying, that it was a capital offense for any of his doctors to say to King Henry, "Henry, you are dying and you must put your house in order." You cannot predict the death of a monarch in many kingdoms. Most kingdoms, typically, that's the way it works. Same thing happened when Elizabeth I was on her deathbed. No one had the courage to say, "Elizabeth, you're dying, put your house in order." And so nothing happened. People scurried about quietly, secretly, making their preparations the best they could, but there could be no public pronouncement. and that this is how we're going to handle the transition. Couldn't happen. Same with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar could not let this challenge that was made publicly, that he, the gold head, that his empire, his dynasty, he personally was going to fall. Because there were plenty of enemies within his empire. There are plenty of people who say, oh yeah, hey, this is great. Now we have someone on our side who's predicting the fall. It undermined his authority, it undermined his security, and to ensure the security of his kingdom, and to ensure the ability that he could flush out his enemies that wanted to see it collapse, he had to make some sort of a public response. So Nebuchadnezzar's public response takes us to chapter number 3. So we see that while Nebuchadnezzar was at first impressed with Daniel's wisdom, his pride soon reasserted itself, and political pressures forced him to respond in a political manner. So, what kind of a test did Nebuchadnezzar devise in chapter 3 for his political subordinates? Well, outwardly, ostensibly, this test was a religious test. But really, it had a powerful political undertone. It was the political undertones that was the real test. So there was a twofold. It had a thin veneer of religiosity at the surface, but underneath, everyone understood that this was a political circumstance as well. So the statute in chapter 3 had a political circumstance to it, with a religious veneer that he chose to overlay it with. You follow what I'm saying? But this is not all that strange, particularly in the ancient world. In our world, in the Western world, we tend to have a little bit of a division between the civil sphere and the religious sphere. And it's very common, particularly for Americans, to understand that the political and the religious have a distinction. And the Bible does offer some distinctions. We have Moses, the political leader, and Aaron, the religious leader in ancient Israel. But the ancient world had a tendency to merge religious and political much more. It was more blended. And so the idea that we could easily separate out religious and political was not something that happened in the ancient world very often. So when Nebuchadnezzar devised a test that was both religious and political at the same time, that made a lot of sense. Even despite the fact that he was basically an irreligious man who didn't care about the gods, he understood that this was politics. And he lived in a world in which religion played a part of things, and he had to appease the people, he had to appease the priesthood, he had to do a lot of factors went into play for him to manage his kingdom well and to remain in power. And there were many enemies that he had that would love to see him fall. So, the underlying reality that this was a test of his political appointee's loyalty. This was a test of his political appointee's loyalty, which was why all the political leaders in his realm were assembled at the dedication of this great statue. It is also why the statue was all gold, because he was making the point that he rejected the interpretation in chapter 2 that the gold kingdom, he would fall. He rejected that interpretation. He said, my kingdom is not going to fall. Not in my lifetime, not in the lifetime of my sons and my grandsons. We are here to stay. And to ensure that we're here to stay, I have devised a test that will flush out those who do not agree with me. And you're going to have to bow down to the statue and show your loyalty to me, that gold image. Remember, all this has been done very publicly. Furthermore, if you'll recall at the end of the last chapter, Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to high positions in the province of Babylon. Now, these are foreigners. These are people who came to Babylon as slaves. And now they have been appointed to rather high political positions in the central heartland of his empire. It's not coincidental that it was jealous, envious Chaldeans, Babylonians, who pointed out that these are the three men that are refusing to be loyal to you. They were jealous. They were irritated. See, he had taken a risk promoting these foreigners. He had irritated ethnic Babylonians. Thus, when he discovered that these three men had really refused and were failing this political/religious test, he was very angry. And we'll discover as moving on, he responded with great rage and out anger toward these three men, because he was personally offended at their refusal. He took their response, as both ungratefulness and personal treason. Ungratefulness and personal treason. So from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, he'd taken a great risk to appoint these three foreigners who had come as slaves, elevated them to positions in the heartland of his empire. Great personal risk. Irritating many ethnic Babylonians who would have loved to have those positions themselves, and are scratching their head and saying, why is our great king elevating foreigners to positions of power here at the capital city? Scratching their heads, this doesn't seem right, this doesn't seem fair. But Nebuchadnezzar, he understood these risks, but he took it because he was so impressed with Daniel, and he saw worth in these men. But he also, when he discovered now that these three men weren't politically reliable, it was a great offense to him. You are ungrateful. This is a personal offense. It is personal treason. So now as we continue to read, we're going to discover he was not just irritated. He was not just angry. He was enraged at this personal offense. Let's continue reading. Let's go to verse 13. We'll read 13 through 18 now. Follow along with me, please. Let's read 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do ye not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So we'll stop there. Again, we don't know what this image was. You can kind of read into it and say, well, it must have been a false god, one of the Babylonian gods. Could have been. But it does show a distinction between serving the god. But we see that it's a religious test. So let's take a minute and look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar, in an effort to ensure political loyalty, had given this situation a veneer of religiosity. He moved it from a purely political circumstance into one that had these powerful religious overtones. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, being faithful to Jehovah, had no choice, really, but to take the whole thing at face value. So while they certainly had no doubt and understood completely that this was a test of their political loyalty, they understood that on the surface, this was a religious issue and it had to be viewed as a religious issue. Because they had a very clear and strict commandment that says that you shall have no other gods before me. So this was a violation of the first commandment in which they had been raised since they were children. So they understood that they had to take it. They had no choice but to take it as a religious offense to them, a religious challenge. And so it was thrown into the religious realm, and it became a religious test. Despite the fact that there were all these political undertones. Certainly we can see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego displayed enormous courage. And we see that these men had to take this problem at face value and respond from the religious point of view. So they had no choice. He had taken their political loyalties and the religious differences and merge them into one. And so they were cornered. They had no alternative. They had no alternatives. Now, I suppose, and I'm on item number 3.C, I suppose that they could have found a way to justify bowing down to the statue by focusing on the political aspect alone. And they could have tried to say, well, yeah, I know that this is really just a political thing, so I can justify it. And of course, human nature being what it is, when we get cornered, most of us do this, don't we? We find ways to justify a little carving away here, a little carving away there, and we shave the situation and we mold it and make it a little bit, and we carve a little truth off here, a little off there, because we don't like being trapped, do we? And we look for an escape route. They didn't really have much of one, did they? Not a very good one. So it was going to be difficult for them to justify this. In good conscience, thus, the religious veneer of the situation, it really gave them no alternative but to refuse. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego now they refused. Now, it's interesting when we look at their refusal, and we look at some of the details here. If you look at verse 16, for example, we see verse 16 that said that they were bold, they were plain, they were clear. It said, we're not careful to answer this matter. We're not careful. That word careful means unprepared. We're not unprepared. Look, they knew the situation was coming. All the men who had been invited to the plain of Dura knew why they'd been invited. They were being invited for the dedication ceremony of this great image that had taken probably weeks or months to construct and to erect. So when they came to this dedication ceremony, they knew what they were in for. It's likely they knew exactly how the problem. They knew that they could not refuse to come. They knew they had to be present. They knew what was going to be asked of them, most likely. They had time to prepare. And so that's why they were able to say, we are not careful. We are not unprepared. We're not unprepared. And that's an important point. They had forethought, and they had perceived where this was going. They perceived that they were going to be trapped, and they perceived this is our only way that we can respond in good conscience. Furthermore, we see that in verse 17 and 18, that they had no strong expectation of deliverance. They boldly said, our God is able to deliver us. But they plainly stated, he may choose not to. And we're ready for that. It makes a great story because God did deliver them. It'd make a great story if God didn't deliver them. There are certainly stories of martyrs in which God chose not to deliver a faithful believer. Stephen, for example, in the New Testament, and others. Peter, Paul. Many, in the end, received no deliverance. So it makes a great story either way. They were prepared for that. And they had thought about this. And there's a lesson for that enough for us. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this story, why was Daniel not present? Why was Daniel not present? Well, it's unknown. That is to say, I could not glean. Perhaps someone here has insight as to why Daniel was not present. I can only speculate. But Daniel remains obscure. Now, Daniel was one of the loftiest of all of Nebuchadnezzar's political rulers. But Daniel remains obscure, and I believe we can safely conclude he was not present. It would be that Nebuchadnezzar, by choice and by intent, allowed Daniel not to come, knowing that Daniel, whom he was so impressed with, would fall right into this trap, and he would be forced to destroy Daniel, and he did not want to destroy Daniel. Could be, but we don't know. Daniel remained obscure. From this, though, we can glean something. We'll also notice that Daniel never got involved in this, did he? There's no evidence that Daniel got involved. He did not rush into the situation. He did not stick his neck out intentionally. Whatever obscurity Daniel had, he took advantage of that. And he remained completely low profile, in fact, out of sight this entire episode. His friends were unable to. He remained out of sight. I think we can conclude from this that avoiding a trap is acceptable. If your enemy lays a trap for you, you don't have to step into it to make a point that you're not going to fall for it.
Yeah.
You don't have to step into it to make the point that I will not go along with it. It's okay to remain obscure. Or to rephrase this, you may not have to engage in every conflict that unfolds in your world. If you engage in every conflict that unfolds in your sphere of life, I'm inclined to say you're going to be in conflict all the time. So Daniel chose not to get involved, took advantage of whatever loophole Nebuchadnezzar had given him. Let's continue now. Let's read the rest of the story. We'll pick it up at verse 19, and we'll read on down to the end of the chapter. So follow along with me and get your Bible out, please. Let's look at it again. And let's see what we can glean as we move into the second portion of this Bible study here. Beginning at verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You understand, he had looked upon them once with favor, but they had, from his point of view, betrayed him. Personal betrayal. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, and other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, that is, he was amazed, astonished. And he rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose body the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed. Neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire passed on them. Remarkable. And Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel, and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that every nation, people, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the province of Babylon. So now we're familiar with this remarkable story, and it's amazing, it's tremendous, it's astonishing that the men who cast them into the fire were killed by the heat of the flames. And these 3 men were unharmed. And then we have this fourth person, this fourth personality appears. Now, scholars will kind of look into this. You may find it capitalized. The word Son of God is a phrase capitalized in your Bible. It's because that's sort of an editorial commentary that many scholars, maybe perhaps a majority, believe that this might have been Jesus Christ, a pre-incarnate form of Jesus Christ present in there. Could have been an angel. I'm not here to debate that. I would probably lean toward the idea that this was indeed pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. But that's not the central point for us. The central point is that these men showed this enormous amount of courage. They were prepared for the challenge that they saw coming. They handled it well prior to being cast into the flame. And God delivered them in a most remarkable public way. And Nebuchadnezzar's response now is very important, as we're going to see. This is what's critical. This is perhaps one of the most important points, is Nebuchadnezzar's responses. So let's look at a few moments of the results of this amazing miracle. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar recognized this as a sign from heaven. Nebuchadnezzar, he's an intelligent man. This is a smart man, smart. Powerful, insightful, even, I argue, somewhat teachable. Prideful, enormous pride, but, pride sometimes is a how should we say, it comes along with great success and intelligence. It's hard for pride not to follow along in human nature. So he recognized that this was a sign from heaven. Now when he said he looks like the Son of God, don't read too much into Nebuchadnezzar's observation and say, oh, Nebuchadnezzar became a believer of Jehovah and is now worshiping Jesus Christ. No. The phrase Son of God is used, believe it or not, that phrase Son of God is used in other religions. And essentially what it means in other religions is a context. They mean that it is some sort of a human form of a deity that's come down from heaven. So when Nebuchadnezzar says the form is like the Son of God, he's saying, I see that there is something miraculous happening here. I see that this is a tremendous sign from heaven that is undeniable. This is a sign from the realm of the gods. In his mind, this is a sign of the world of the gods. The deities up there have sent a clear signal that this particular belief system, this God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is something remarkable and great. And I can't deny that. So he's recognizing that this was a sign from heaven, and he's showing that he was intelligent, even teachable, despite his pride. Now, the results of this miracle, there's a lot of good things, but let's get it all straight. First of all, let's note this. No matter how closely you look at the positive things that Nebuchadnezzar did in verses 28 and 29, Nebuchadnezzar is not converted to become a worshiper of Jehovah. Nebuchadnezzar does not say, oh, this is my God. I'm going to worship Jehovah. I want to know more about your religion. Give me a copy of the prophets. Show me the law of Moses. I'm interested in learning about the religion. He did not do any of that. He recognized this as a sign from heaven. He was intelligent enough, honest enough, to not let his pride get in the way of what he witnessed. But he did not convert to a worship of Jehovah. But what he did do is something that may be more important. He allowed Judeans now freedom of worship. He allowed them freedom of worship. Now, this is a remarkable privilege in the ancient world. The ancient world does not have very many examples of what we take for granted in our culture, in our society, here in the United States of America. We, for better or for worse, some might say worse, but for better or for worse, we take it for granted that we have freedom of worship in the United States. And so that is now bringing, that particular policy may have unintended consequences that are now irritating us in our time. But nonetheless, it's something that is not foreign to the modern mind, is it? Freedom of worship. But this was foreign to the ancient world. Politics and religion lay closely hand in hand. And freedom of worship was not something that very many ancient civilizations allowed. In fact, there's another famous example of a great emperor doing something similar to Nebuchadnezzar, setting up an image of himself in an attempt to trap believers of Jehovah. And that was Caligula of the Roman Empire. Caligula of the Roman Empire attempted to erect a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem for the purpose of forcing a conflict with the Judeans. It actually didn't happen. The statue didn't actually get there. Caligula died, and everybody rejoiced because he was a crazy man. But that's another story. So the Judeans were allowed freedom of worship, a remarkable privilege in the ancient world. This is described in verse 28 and 29. Now, this freedom of worship was not extended to everyone, was it? This was not a blanket freedom of worship for all religions. It was a special dispensation for the worshipers of Jehovah. And he had to impose this by force upon all the people around his empire because they would not like this idea. His local magistrates and judges and counselors, all the Chaldeans and Babylonians are saying, what are you doing? Why would you give them freedom to worship Jehovah? I mean, we're just going to soon have religious chaos in our whole empire, and the empire is going to fall apart. And so he had to say, no, they get religious liberties here at pain of death. Don't speak against them. They have my cover, my special cover of protection. My special cover of protection. The miracle, this miracle was not at its heart, in my view, about saving three good men. That was incidental. Saving these three good men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, brave men, courageous, absolutely incredibly brave, incredibly courageous, incredibly committed. Tremendous examples of what godly manhood should be about. But it was less about saving these three good men than it was about God using the most powerful man on the planet, Nebuchadnezzar, to provide protection for the Judeans now in exile. It was about converting Nebuchadnezzar to a new policy. This miracle was about changing Nebuchadnezzar and altering his view so that all these other Judeans in Babylon, who had come as slaves and low people at the very bottom level of society now, in exile, in the province of Babylon, they now had the privilege to worship their God without molestation. That's a marvelous thing. God did not forget about the Hebrew people, even though most of them had not been particularly faithful or obedient to Jehovah. So, well, wait a minute. Daniel was, and these three men were, true. But let's get it right. The reason they were taken out of the land of Judea and taken in captivity to the land of Babylon is because they had been unfaithful. They had forgotten all about their God Jehovah. But now, despite the fact that most of them coming into Babylon were now in this low and abject, humiliating state, God had mercy on them still. He still had mercy on them. He was giving them yet another chance. And that is beautiful. This shows the mercy of God. It shows the justice of God. Because, believe me, it was no picnic to be hauled into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. And the pain and humiliation degradation and destruction and murder and horrible things happening when they were taken out of the land of Judea and hauled in chains, brought in chains to Babylon, would have been probably one of the most humiliating things you could possibly imagine if you even survived at all. But in that low degree, God did not forget about them. They had forgotten about God. They had forgotten about Jehovah, but He did not forget about them. And He was giving them yet another chance, another opportunity, another window in which they could turn their hearts back toward Him. Unfortunately, they had at least 4 brave men, Daniel and these 3, as examples in the court of the high king, as leaders, as intercessors, as someone who could stand in their stead. And God used them to create this privilege for all the rest of the Judeans, despite the fact they had not been particularly faithful or obedient. God did not forget about the Hebrew people. I believe these 3 men knew the challenge was less about them. I really do. I really think that they, and I'm reading between the lines on this particular point, but I really think these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew the challenge was less about them than it was about God's reputation and the larger plans for His people. And they knew that they were on the firing line, and that the test that was before them was not just about them. It was about all that they represented, and all the other people that represented, and how God could possibly use them to change this powerful man and turn his heart in a direction that would be pleasing to the people and give them an opportunity to return to God. Now, there's a lot more into this story. Something else we haven't touched on, really, but it's quite important and very practical for all of us. I'd like to shift gears the last few minutes that we have and consider principles of authority. There are principles of authority that we can glean from this story. And I don't know if these, for many of us, these are not hard nor revolutionary. For others, they are. For others, they are. So let's go through 6 quick points about authority that I think will be of great value if we can apply them. One thing I might say, like many tests in life, in the abstract, these are easy to understand. They're not complex. It's not in the understanding that the problem is. It's in the applying. It's like forgiveness. In abstract, forgiveness is easy. Someone hurts somebody, somebody hurts you, turn the other cheek, forget about it, move on. Oh, very easy in the abstract. Until you apply it in your life. You're the one that got hurt. Now it's very hard. Very hard. Authority is the same way. Very easy to understand in the abstract, but can you apply it? Can you live it? Are you willing to try to apply it and live it? Are you committed to what the Word of God says in this area? Or are the principles of authority something you can take on and off and change like you change your dirty shirt? I'll take it or leave it. Well, here's what I say, right? Point number 1. Pretty simple here. I've tried to keep it simple. I suppose we can make it more complex, but try to keep it short and sweet. We should obey all the laws of our human authorities unless they violate a principle given to us from God. Obey all the laws of our human authorities unless they violate a principle given to us from God. And the New Testament has a number of places we can go to that will help us in this area. Let me read for you 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 13. 1 Peter 2, beginning at verse 13, it says, Peter offers this advice. Now, this is the New Testament church. We've jumped forward about 600 years. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. So we could make quite a study of that particular passage right there, but I'll just let it stand on its own. Obey the laws of our human authorities unless they ask us to violate a principle given to us from God. Point B, if possible, we should seek to avoid conflict between human authority and divine authority? Can we avoid a conflict between human authority and divine authority? I believe that is the wise way. And indeed, we have, by omission, an example of that in the case of Daniel. Daniel avoided this conflict, and I believe he was not wrong to do so. Jeremiah 29:7 has these words. You may recognize this. This was advice that Jeremiah gave to the children of Israel on the eve of them going in to captivity in Babylon. This is what he said that they ought to do. Jeremiah 29:7. Seek the peace of the city whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray to the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof you shall have peace. It echoes the words of Jesus in Matthew 5:25. And this is something you'll recognize. Matthew 5:25, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, Agree with thine adversary quickly, whiles thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge deliver thee to the officer, thou be cast into prison. Well, I believe that's a valid principle here. Avoid a conflict between human authority and divine authority. You can. Point C. Next. When for conscience sake you must disobey an authority. And that time will come in our lives from time to time. There will be moments in our lives when, for conscience sake, because God has given a clear principle, you are compelled to say to your civil authority, your earthly authority, a human authority, I just can't do what you want me to do. I just can't do it. So how do we go about then? When for conscience sake you must disobey an authority, be clear about the principle on which you stand. Be clear about the principle upon which you stand. Make sure he understands why you are not complying. I've seen many times when people say, I'm not going to do what you say. But the authority figure walks away thinking it's a different reason than what the person means. Because the person has not made it clear why they can't comply. They muddy the water. No doubt there's going to be a lot of emotion. There's a lot of emotion that's involved in these circumstances. And as our brother pointed out, emotion often can be a problem if we allow the emotion to override clear thinking, sensible thinking. We've got to set the emotions aside and make sure we're clearly communicating the point upon which we are standing. That's our duty. We're going to say to an authority, I cannot comply. You have a duty to make sure he understands why and what the point is that you're making. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did this in the story we just looked at. And back in chapter number 1, Daniel did that with respect to the food. Point D. Do not unnecessarily antagonize your human authority. Don't antagonize them. Do not unlawfully attempt to remove him from his position. These three men, they didn't antagonize Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't try to remove him from being the king, from being the emperor. They didn't start a movement. They didn't start a revolution. They say, oh, what about the American Revolution? Well,